America's energy infrastructure will likely be pushed to its limits in the coming years. It's already been stretched by existing factors like changing weather patterns and extreme heat, a shifting resource mix, and early retirement of power plants. But a developing boom in energy-intensive data centers, paired with the reshoring of American manufacturing and increasing electrification of transportation, home appliances, and more, is adding new pressures to the system to perform. You're listening to the second installment of Energy Rush, a special four-part podcast series from the Electric Power Supply Association, looking at how the grid is responding to a rapid rise in electric power demand. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, President and CEO of EPSA. In this episode, you'll hear from Jim Robb, President and CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. We'll also talk with Christi Tezak, Senior Director at Clearview Energy Partners, and Aftab Khan, Executive Vice President of Operations, Planning, and Security at PJM Interconnection, the largest power grid operator in the United States. These three experts assess the situation, bringing key data points and realistic predictions for where power demand is going, the state of the grid, and steps that must be taken to ensure a reliable energy expansion despite the growing challenges of rising demand. First up is Jim Robb, President and CEO of NERC, which serves as the reliability watchdog for the North American power system. Jim lays out NERC's data on load growth and tells us just how much demand has skyrocketed in the past 5 years. He also talks about the premature retirements of natural gas and coal-fired power plants and what that pace means for the nation's electric reliability at a time where we will need more power, not less, to meet demand. Here's Jim. Thanks, Jim. We're really glad that you could join us again on our podcast. How much power do you think is going to be needed to support the growth of AI or data centers, reshoring, electrification, all the things that are driving this load growth? And how do you see that changing over the last 5 years, and where's it going in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I'll answer the question with a very scientific answer, Todd. A boatload. How's that?
That sounds like an industry term I can get around.
Because it is actually very hard to discern the exact number, and I can explain why in a minute. But the long-term assessment we published last December, so 2023, showed almost twice the load growth over the ensuing 10-year period than what we did in 2019.
Wow!
Right, so a doubling of load growth, and I think the numbers that we published last year will prove to be conservative relative to what we'll see this year, because we really didn't have the load growth associated with AI and data centers as well understood last year when we were putting that together. One thing that's important to know is that that's not evenly distributed. Right. The growth that we're seeing is higher in the winter than in the summer. That's important. We can talk about the implications of winter load growth. The other issue is that it's not geographically evenly distributed either. So on average, that works out to about a 1 to 1.5% growth in load across the country. But if you look at Texas, if you look at the U.S. South, those numbers look more like 3 to 6%.
Which are unheard of in the last 15 years or so.
No, because the electric sector hasn't grown appreciably because of all the investment in energy efficiency and the natural things we've done around appliance turnover and the like. So it's a very different ball game, and all the reliability issues that you and I have talked about over the years just get exacerbated because of this growth outlook.
What are some of the data points that you're looking at as you look at system reliability concerns or how we need to be tackling some of this?
Yeah, so let me talk through, and I'm going to be talking off the data set we published in December last year, right? So recognize that these numbers are already kind of out of date, but it's the most robust set that I've got. So as we look forward over the 2024 to 2033, so that's kind of the time horizon. We're seeing peak load grow in the summer around 78 gigawatts, 90 gigawatts in the winter. Again, that's that winter-summer differential I mentioned. I'll talk a little bit about that.
And that's just the growth. That's not total. That's just the growth in demand.
Oh, that's just growth, right? That's on top of a terawatt scale system.
Right. It's huge.
So that's about one, like I said, a little over 1% on average. We're seeing about 83 gigawatts of confirmed retirements over that period of time. That's mostly coal and older gas units, maybe some nuclear in there too. But it's important to note that in addition to that 83 that we've baked into our assessment, there's another 100 gigawatts out there that's at high risk of retirement over that period of time, whether due to just natural aging of facilities or policy decisions that are could restrict the operation of some of those fleets. So 80 to 180 gigawatts of generation coming out. We're seeing about 34 gigawatts of net new capacity coming on the system. Now, 34 gigawatts relative to 80 to 90 gigawatts of growth says we're not moving in the right direction, right? Things are getting tighter. Of that 34 gigawatts, the majority of that is solar. About 70 gigawatts of new solar generation. Some of that will have batteries with it, some gas in that mix, and some wind, fair amount of offshore wind. So a couple things that tells you. One, we're not keeping up on an energy basis, right? Because we're retiring facilities that have the potential at least to operate in base load or in dispatchable mode, replacing that with generation that's available when it's available, right? With variable production profile, wind and solar. The other issue is that, because so much of this is solar being added to the grid, solar is important to note is a terrific resource, particularly for the summer. You have long days. The production profile of solar tends to match the load. And if you add batteries with it, that's even better, because one of the things with solar is you tend to push the peak off a couple hours. Right. And so the batteries kind of help bridge that and manage the ramping that would otherwise happen on generation. But solar is not nearly as good a resource in the winter. One, there's just less sunshine because of the diurnal cycle. And second, the timing of the peak is likely shifting to much later in the day, even overnight, particularly with winter load growth being driven by heat pumps for space heating. So the solar battery combinations, very helpful in the summer. And we saw that last year with the heat dome. We're seeing it this year, getting through these hot temperatures. Not as great in the winter. We know that gas has issues in the winter, particularly on, as you and I have talked, the 10 to 15 days where we get these stressful situations. So we're increasingly dependent on solar, increasingly dependent on gas, and that those are less good resources, less reliable for the winter. And the thing that concerns me from a societal perspective is that winter shortfalls, as we saw in Texas in 2021, winter shortfalls are much more problematic to deal with than summer ones. They're harder to restore. And also, people have the opportunity to take matters into their own hands, right? They can sit in their garage, turn on their car to heat themselves up. And that's why you end up with, 250 deaths.
Very bad outcomes.
With cold. Yeah. So we really got to be paying attention to that shift from summer to winter. We actually see most areas of the country shifting to being winter peaking, as particularly with electrification policies around space heating. So the resource mix relative to the load growth that we're seeing is going to be increasingly challenging for us to work through.
It sounds like that puts you right into the fifth criteria that you've added to your list of concerns most recently in your outlook, which is the policy implications, because a lot of policy decisions are driving the resource mix reordering and what's being added and what's being retired. And that feels like that's a question that clearly is going to need to be addressed sooner rather than later. Are there other things that you think about in the aggregate that are putting pressure on the system as well that maybe policymakers aren't thinking about, or maybe they're thinking about it a little, but they aren't thinking about it enough?
Yeah, there are a couple. So right now, you have to remember that electricity is not an energy source. It's a delivery mechanism. And in the US right now, about 20% of end-use energy is consumed in the form of electricity. The rest being largely petroleum for transportation and petroleum products for space heating and industrial uses. So if we were to electrify everything as one of our strategies to deal with climate change and carbon emissions, at the extreme, that would suggest a quintupling of the size of the electric sector. Now, I don't think anybody really thinks that's going to happen. But if you look at people that have studied this issue very carefully, like EPRI, for example, they would say tripling the size of the system is very consistent with the policies that are being put in place and being talked about. We find it very difficult to permit large scale infrastructure.
I was just going to say, my eyebrows went up because, oh, really? We're going to permit enough to triple the system.
Right. So that's
a challenge.
That's the breakdown, right? Yeah. So we have these bold aspirations for electrification, but then all of the realities of our policies make those almost impossible to meet. And by the way, they would have been very, very hard for us to meet with just the current system and current sources and uses of electricity. You talk about, doubling, over the next 15, 20 years, even tripling the size of the system, your head starts to really scratch. You really start to scratch your head around how are we going to do that?
Yeah, exactly right.
And one of the other peculiarities is that if you look at the interconnection queues for new generation, it's almost all wind and solar. Batteries are in there too, and some amount of gas, but not a lot. The characteristics of wind and solar have one clear thing, right? You can't move the fuel, right? You got to move it as power, right? So that wind and solar resource is largely across the backbone of the continent. Not that there's not wind elsewhere, but that's where the really rich resource is. The really rich solar resource is in the desert Southwest. So we were going to have to build large scale transmission projects if those are the generation sources we're going to be developing. We're going to have to build a lot of transmission and a lot of multi-state transmission projects. And so I see a lot of challenge in getting there. So relative to building the infrastructure, the other piece that I think people need to get their head around is the role of batteries. And I'm really, really thrilled to see the amount of battery projects that are being talked about. Almost 260 gigawatts are in some stage of development. We tend to think of batteries as a supply source. They're also a major load, right? So you think about 260 gigawatts of batteries,
got to charge it somehow.
There's no net energy there, right? You got to be able to put juice into them. So batteries, we need to understand batteries are time machines, right? They're not generating resources. And so we got to get our thinking clear about that. Doesn't mean that they're not valuable by any stretch of the imagination, but they're not going to solve the load growth challenge. There are, when you talk to kind of leading thinkers around end-use energy management, virtual power plant creation, all of these things, the role of hydrogen and so forth, all these things can play a role. The issue you run into, or at least I run into, is I hear a lot of kilowatt and megawatt solutions, right? We have to get
terawatt problem.
What are the things that, and those are great, by the way, but we got to get our head around how do we create gigawatt and eventually terawatt scale solutions, and that's an entirely different kettle of fish.
Yeah, I think that's right.
One thing on the data center question, I mentioned that it's very challenging to forecast, and there are a couple things here that we're working to figure out how we're going to unpack. One is we're undoubtedly seeing multiple interconnection requests for the same data center, right?
Sure.
People are shopping, trying to figure out, well, who can actually hook me up and who can supply me. So there's going to be some work to be done to kind of handicap those and figure out what the real number is. The second thing, we dealt with a variant of this issue in the early 2000s. When the internet and e-commerce exploded. And I think the one thing that we've got to keep our head around is that the energy productivity of the chips will improve over time, right? And in fact, NVIDIA's CEO has already kind of come out with Wong's Law around energy productivity improvement.
Okay.
The second thing is that the AI computing algorithms will improve over time. There'll be less operations needed per query. So, our current mindset of 10 times the energy of a Google search, well, that's today's reality. Probably won't be the reality 5 years, 10 years from now. So that's another thing we got to start to unpack, because we're clearly on a path to embed AI in so many aspects of our technology applications that it's going to be a real upward pressure, but hard to say what is. If you'll let me
Sure.
digress on one other issue around the data center question. When I first heard the large load, we had to get our head around large loads. I was thinking 50 megawatt type loads.
Right.
These are gigawatt, 1.5 gigawatt interconnection requests for single undiversified loads. They're either on or they're off.
Yep.
And so I came and I says, what is a gigawatt? Well, a gigawatt is the aggregate load of the city of San Francisco, right? That you just dimensioning the scale of these things is really, really critical. It's a large nuclear unit. It's one of the Vogel units.
Right. Dedicated just to that facility.
Just to that one facility.
For one. Yeah.
The other issue is when you have facilities of that scale, right? If they're not operated well, or if they would be corrupted by a cyber actor, right? That started to turn facilities on and off, for example, a 1 gigawatt load swing can start to create oscillations onto the grid. So we're starting to think through what reliability implications are, because we've never dealt with a single load of that scale.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. This is just new territory for us.
I'm trying to think. Well, that's great. There's only more challenges in front of us. We keep adding to the list, Jim. I keep hoping that at one of these times we're going to have a call and you're like, we've actually solved that. We're on to the next thing down, but the list just keeps growing. So I'm not often speechless, but that one kind of made me go, I hadn't thought about that. So with that, you've done a lot of testifying of late. You've been traveling around, I think, trying to raise the alarm in an appropriate way. Not sky is falling, but having some reality-based conversations with policymakers and regulators. As you look at it, if you had, the opportunity to say, policymaker X, state or federal, there's 3 or 4 things that you need to do for us to meet the moment and meet this rising demand.
Absolutely.
What would you say are the 3 or 4 things that people need to be keeping in mind? Because I think we need to start keeping that list.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Todd. So I think first of all, I think of the objectives we need to have. One is we need to get a lot of resources added to the system, right? We need to deconstipate the interconnection queues, and we need to make sure that those resources are showing up, on time. And they're mostly going to be, as I said, wind and solar based on today's view of the world. Maybe we'll see a little bit of a renaissance with gas as these loads are growing. So we got to get resources onto the grid. Second, we're going to need transmission to move the power around and create resilience against the weather systems that we're seeing, as well as get stuff from, the desert Southwest to Chicago and Dakotas to Los Angeles and so forth. And then we really got to pay attention to how we're going to balance the peaks and valleys and the fuel droughts that'll ensue with that. So we're going to need to be really thoughtful about how we secure the balancing resources of the grid, which is primarily right now gas, and probably will be gas for the foreseeable future until we get a long duration battery technology. So if that's what we need to achieve, I think there are 4 or 5 things that policymakers need to be paying attention to. One is we really do need to think through how we create better long-term integrated planning processes for gas and electric resources and transmission, right? If we have a 17-year development cycle for electric transmission and a 5-year planning cycle for other things, they're just out of whack, right? So we got to figure out how to marry those up, and we got to start planning the gas and the electric system and coordinating those much more than we do today. Second, we're going to need to figure out cost allocation for multi-state investments, whether that's natural gas or transmission, and we need siting and permitting reform. because the
Amen
things
to
that are
that.
the things that are slowing down projects is less we don't know where the good projects are. It's more we don't know how to get cost allocation done across multiple jurisdictions, and we're stuck on siting.
Yeah.
So it was great to see FERC take a run at that with their Order 1920. I know there's a lot of controversy as to whether or not they got that precisely right, but we got to start having that conversation around how to deal with siting, cost allocation, and then better long-term planning. Second, we really got to address the gas electric coordination issues, right? I talked about the need for better integrated planning, but that also extends to the commercial practices between the two sectors, to the short-term operational situation awareness between the two, so that when we get into one of these events, we're making intelligent decisions to protect society, right? Whether it's
in the end, that's the goal.
Right. And if you think about the hierarchy of needs for gas, right, it's you got to keep the pilot lights lit because nobody wants to see the need to go out and re-energize a gas distribution system.
Right.
And as you know, Con Ed came very close to having to do that in New York City during the Elliott storm, and that would have been a catastrophe of truly biblical proportion.
Yes, agreed.
But so we got to address the gas electric stuff, and I really think we need to focus in on how we can create scalable resources that will meet both our carbon emission appetite as well as our reliability needs. And that really means, geez, we got to be focusing on, how are we going to build a nuclear program that's not going to create a science project, small modular reactor, but it's going to create 1,000 of them, right? And build a supply chain and a workforce to do that. Same with scalable long duration storage. Right? That's the answer to making wind and solar a viable long-term resource for the bulk of the grid, is to be able to balance that and deal with the fuel droughts, right? Again, we have a lot of great science projects underway, and I don't mean that as pejoratively as it sounds, but we really need to be intentional about, building, a terawatt system based on something very different than we have today. And I don't see us approaching these with that aspiration and appetite to get done. So those would be my points.
Yeah, and I think you've nailed it. That what do they call it? The canyon of death between research and commercialization has got to be shortened and made less deep. So I appreciate you drawing attention to that.
No, and I think if you come back to where we started with this on load growth, so if we end up meeting the aspirations and that turns out to be a tripling of the electric grid, then we need 3 terawatts, 3,000 gigawatts, 3 million megawatts. That's a lot of stuff. And by the way, it's
short order.
In very short order, right? So, the term moonshot is overused, but this really is one of those things where you'd sit back and say, let's pick one and really invest in making it happen. Because we know with the resources and the creativity of the country and the scientific community and the engineering talent we have, we can make it happen.
Right. We can get there.
But it's going to take a really concerted effort.
Aftab Khan is Executive Vice President of Operations Planning and Security at PJM. He highlights PJM's key data on forecasted load growth and the impacts it will have on the future resource mix, consumer costs, and reliability. He also shares what steps the RTO is taking to prepare for what's coming next. Let's hear from Aftab. Aftab, I can't thank you enough for taking time to visit with us. You've got a lot on your plate, but let's jump right into it. So, when did PJM first really start to take notice of this uptick in load growth?
Well, I'd say the most significant load growth impact on the PJM system has been with data center additions. And, we first started hearing about data centers and their potential large impacts probably about a decade ago. And at first, it really wasn't much, and it was overshadowed by other factors bringing down load like distributed solar and energy efficiency. But that balance over the last few years has started to turn. It was probably early to mid 2022 that we started to see the first reports of really large load increases from the data center alley in Virginia, mainly around Loudoun and Prince William counties. And since then, there's been just a rapid increase in forecasted data center loads, really driven by AI related kind of growth.
Sure. How much does it look like will be needed in the way of new energy to support AI and data centers, but also reshoring of manufacturing as a result of the CHIPS Act and some of the other things that we see happening in the United States? I'm sure you're planning for a range of potential outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we do a formal load forecasting process at PJM, and in early this year, we had issued our 2024 load forecast report, which goes out about 15 years. And just looking at this summer, we were expecting a peak load of a little over 150,000 megawatts. And we currently have AI and data centers comprising about 4% of that peak. So roughly around 6,000 megawatts.
Okay.
But as we look out, by 2030, we forecast that data center load to triple to about 12% of our peak load. So that would be about 20,000 megawatts. And then we obviously go out longer term. So, by the next decade, almost by 2040, and there's more uncertainty as you get further out in that forecast, but it could be 16% of our peak load, data center, AI related peak load. That would be about 30,000 megawatts of load. So obviously, as I said already, it could be a lot of variables the longer out you go on that forecast. But what we do know is that our PJM states have been the focus. Several of our PJM states have been the focus of data center growth, and we expect that to continue.
I'm glad you led me into my next question, which is really, I know that it's unique in where we're seeing some of this growth. It's not uniform across the footprint. So are there states in particular that you're watching, and does that have an impact on how you're thinking about system management?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, right now, Northern Virginia has been one of our big focused areas. But I will say what we start to see in terms of other load additions is really starting to change across our whole PJM footprint.
Okay.
And you had mentioned earlier things like electrification and manufacturing increase. We see increases in other states like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, New Jersey, and Maryland. And we expect other factors to start coming into play. Right now, it's still data centers, but increased electrification manufacturing will certainly come in across our region. But I also want to point out that this is not only a PJM issue, this is like a national issue right now, because the whole country, I think, is seeing this increased demand of electricity. And we know, for example, that our peak load going out to 2039, so about 15 years out, will increase by about 40% to adding about 40,000 megawatts of load.
Yeah, that's huge.
And yeah, it's massive.
What's your outlook, or what's PJM's outlook about how much current capacity is on the system, and then what's going to be needed to supplement that as we arrive at what the future resource mix may look like?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because, obviously forecasting demand is only part of the equation. We have to have the supply to meet that demand. And PJM, we don't own any generation. Basically, what we do is we administer competitive markets to provide that investment signal or investment. So when you look at our current capacity at PJM, we have about 180,000 megawatts of installed capacity as measured by capacity interconnection rights. That generation type today, it's about 48% natural gas, almost half natural gas, 22% coal, 18% nuclear, and today, relatively small amounts of intermittent or limited duration resources at about 4% between solar and wind. But our future mix is going to change. When we look at our interconnection queue today, we have about 250,000 megawatts that we've been processing through the interconnection process. 97% of that is either renewable, wind and solar, or batteries, or hybrid of both. So not all of that's going to get built, of course, but I think these numbers kind of show that there's going to be a significant shift in our resource mix to meet that load.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's a bit staggering when you think that you have almost 1.5 times your existing installed capacity waiting to determine whether or not they're going to join or not join. I mean, those are pretty staggering numbers. And I think it's not unique to PJM. I know other regions are experiencing the same kind of thing. So I'm sure you're all collectively trying to figure out how to navigate through that. It's no easy process. And I know there are always folks who are happy to criticize, but we know you've got a heavy responsibility there. So As we look at some of these other issues, are things like weather also part of how you're looking at forecasting? I mean, we talked about electrification and manufacturing, of course, but there are other impacts to the system. And how are you thinking about how you navigate through increased demand, increased supply, and then changing weather that is having an impact on the system as well? I mean, we've had a relatively hot summer so far, and as we're recording, it's not even August. So we've still got a lot of summer left.
Some people may have a misconception that at PJM, we just kind of roll up the forecast from our member utilities, but we actually generate an independent load forecast. And it begins with independent data sources to look at what's going on in the residential, commercial, industrial sectors, as well as, what's going on with that electric vehicle adoption, behind the meter solar forecast. And we do that by each PJM zone. The electric distribution companies, or EDCs, they give us input, but we go through the process really to rationalize that and make sure things aren't being double counted.
Right.
And you brought up weather. A lot of those forecasts incorporate some elements of weather forecasts, but we also try to think about what's been going on with climate change impacts. So we have seen the frequency of severe weather events increasing.
Yep.
That not only impacts peak load, but it impacts the duration of peak loads.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are all factors that work into the load forecasting that we do in various ways. But to your original question, absolutely. Weather is a key factor and another aspect of impact of peak load that we're constantly thinking about.
So I think we've danced around all of the inputs to some of the things that you're facing, but the $64,000 question for those old enough to remember that show is, how's this going to impact the system? As you look at it, what are the things that you're trying to address? What are the concerns that you're trying to preempt? And how are you thinking about how the challenges to the system will ensure a reliable system can operate? Because at the end of the day, that's what all of us are striving to achieve.
No, absolutely. And I think we've been pretty clear as PJM about our concern, mainly around the retirement of existing generators that's outpacing the addition of new generation. So, for example, we're dealing with a challenging situation with the retirement of some critical plants like Brandon Shores and Wagner in the Baltimore area. And so, we took a hard look at this in a paper that we published, which we affectionately refer to as the 4R report.
That got a lot of attention, I think, exactly as intended.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's resource retirements, replacements, and risks, so 4Rs. But we've identified trends that could potentially reduce electric supply to concerning levels even by the end of this decade.
Yeah.
And the trends are really a combination of, retirements, load growth, and the pace of new generation entry, and a risk that those won't align and lead to a supply shortage. Generators are retiring at a rapid pace due to various government, private sector policies, as well as economics. PJM's analysis shows that 40,000 megawatts of existing generation are at risk of retirement by 2030. Combined, that represents about 21% of our current installed capacity. And the majority of those retiring resources are expected to be coal and natural gas. And coal and natural gas, along with nuclear, constitute what we call thermal resources with distinct physical characteristics that can also be dispatched and ramped up and down at PJM's discretion. And when you combine this with the fact that the retirements are outpacing potentially the new generation build, we have a significant concern really around future resource adequacy. So really what we're saying is that margins have been narrowing. This is something we've been actively communicating. We posted that 4R paper in early 2023, and we've been working actively internally and with our stakeholders to take action.
Yeah, I'm not exceptionally good at math, but when you tell me there's potentially 40 that could come off and 40 that could be added, that feels like a delta of 80. That's a big number. And I know there's a lot in the queue, as you noted, and some of that will come on the system, but certainly not all of it. And trying to resolve those issues is just vitally important. You talked a little bit about what's all in the queue that you expect is going to come through the process, but are there the performance characteristics that you just noted? are there types of resources that you're especially concerned about either retaining or adding?
Yeah, and so maybe, one thing I would like to emphasize around the queue, because as you
Sure.
kind of commented earlier, it gets a lot of attention, right? And I think it's important to note that we're in the midst of a pretty significant transformation of our interconnection queue process. We actually
Yeah.
started it mid last year. And, key elements of the change are shifting from a first in, first out to
Mm-hmm.
more of a first ready, first served structure.
Yep.
And the good news I'm happy to report is that we're progressing on plan, on schedule, and we're just finishing up the first decision point of the first transition cycle in this interconnection process. And we're pretty confident that the new approach will help weed out projects that are not likely to get built and free up resources for other projects that are still in various phases of study. So I think that's an important part of what we can do to support the needed resources for the future.
For sure.
But the other thing I wanted to kind of emphasize is we have, again, the 40,000 number is a common theme, but we have close to 40,000 megawatts of resources through the interconnection process with signed interconnection agreements and not getting built for various reasons. And anecdotally, developers tell us various reasons. It could range from financing, supply chain, siting. But the bottom line is they're not getting built, and that's a real concern that we have moving forward. But we are doing everything we can to process that queue and advance projects through our queue.
Yeah, it's in everybody's interest. Certainly no one thinks you're holding them up on purpose. Certainly not. As you look at, you mentioned permitting and siting and transmission obstacles. Do you view that as especially challenging?
I would say it's certainly a concern that we have, but I think it's important to note that when it comes to transmission, PJM does not own or construct the transmission lines. What we are doing is we are selecting projects after we identify needs and solicit proposals through a FERC-approved process. What we do, though, is that we evaluate transmission projects submitted by the transmission developers to consider the risks of constructability that include permitting, whether going through sensitive areas, and other factors that could impact those lines being built. So it's part of our evaluation, but ultimately the responsibility to design, construct, and then go through a siting or permitting process is with the transmission developers.
That's right.
But it is a concern that we have that the process of getting transmission built is certainly getting more challenging.
Yeah. As we talk about now transmission, but we've been talking about generation and market supply and demand dynamics. Is there a trend that you are watching with regard to costs and consumers? I mean, PJM has a terrific value statement. I mean, every year we look at it and the value to customers is in the multiple billions of dollars. And so it is a real benefit, and our members are happy to participate in that market and deliver some of those savings to customers. But a lot of this is expensive, as you noted, and it is none of it's free.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As you pointed out, our goal here at PJM is ensuring reliability, but doing it as cost efficiently as possible.
Yeah.
And we're very sensitive to the rates and cost impacts. Although, as you know, PJM does not set the retail rates.
That's right.
But, wholesale energy costs is something that we are responsible for managing through our markets and through our transmission plans. And we just remain focused on that mission. But that being said, some of these emerging future challenges will require us to evolve markets, will require us to look at different kinds of transmission build. And again, what we will do that the most cost efficiently as we can. But there certainly is a chance of that having an impact on rates.
Yeah, and I think that's just an honest conversation that we need to have with consumers, because as everyone's father or mother probably told them, nothing's free in life, and that is very true.
Exactly.
So I know you struggle to stay out of the policy space. You're implementers, you're not policy developers, but if you were talking to those who are in a position to make some decisions, what kind of things need to be done in order to support your effort to address rising demand? Are there things that state or federal policymakers should be keeping in mind as they look at how you're trying to ensure a reliable, cost-effective delivery of the system to consumers of all types?
Yeah, so some of the key messages that we've been trying to reinforce with the policymakers is that, be cautious of advancing legislation that could further exacerbate the retirement of PJM's existing generation fleet without ensuring that there's adequate replacement resources.
Right.
It's as we kind of talked through already, we need to balance that. And then the other thing that we try to emphasize is the focus on how to bring new resources onto the system as quickly as possible. And whether that be reforms to permitting processes, reducing supply chain backlogs, or other state-related assistance to facilitate the connection of new resources onto the PJM system. And again, it ties back to the 4R report. It's just a message that we are trying to get out there with everyone to help ensure that everybody is aligned with us on ensuring reliability.
Yeah, and that is the spot we all want to be. So as we get near the end of our conversation, I've just got a couple of questions left for you. So, of course, from our seat, we think competitive markets really can meet the moment. But I'm curious if PJM still believes that competitive markets can meet the challenge. What's needed to ensure the continued success of markets?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, as you know, and you've kind of pointed out already, we've used the power of competition to reinforce short and long-term reliability by using the market signals as an incentive for both investment in new generation and replacement of the older, less efficient generation. And I think you already kind of touched on the range of numbers, but the value that PJM has brought through competitive markets is in the range of $3.2 to $4 billion in annual value to customers, while significantly improving reliability in the region. So we firmly believe, to answer your question, we firmly believe in competitive markets and that they are a proven tool that can meet the challenges of the future. We do recognize, though, that the composition and performance characteristics of the resource mix will ultimately determine our ability to maintain reliability. And so we've been working internally and with our stakeholders to implement a number of market changes to ensure reliability. I think just one example of a recent change is updating our effective load carrying capability, or ELCC accreditation, which now uses a probabilistic approach and hourly assessment to evaluate a generation resource's contribution to reliability. So we believe these kind of enhancements in our market and others that we're working on will help ensure that the PJM wholesale market continue to provide that critical role to cost effectively ensuring regional reliability. And I believe somewhere along the way may have mentioned an initiative that we call Ensuring a Reliable Energy Transition. And I would encourage anyone interested to learn more about the actions that PJM has taken to that section of our webpage, again, Ensuring a Reliable Energy Transition. And there we give a lot more information on the various actions that are either completed or underway across PJM markets, operations, and planning to support all these challenges for the future.
Aftab, can you talk a little bit about how the regional approach benefits consumers, both in terms of reliability, availability of resources, and kind of how the market functions in a way that delivers value across the 13 states and District of Columbia?
Sure, absolutely. So when I had mentioned the $3.2 billion to $4 billion annual value to customers of PJM, one of the things embedded in that is by being a larger region, which is a single balancing authority, we can develop a resource plan for resource adequacy that includes the entire region, versus if the PJM region were comprised of multiple different balancing authorities. Each balancing authority would have to develop their own resource plan, resource mix, and needed reserve margins for resource adequacy. So by being a larger PJM region, we can look at everything that's going on across the region and develop that optimized resource plan, which provides tremendous value to customers. In addition to that, we coordinate with our neighbors. So ISO New England or New York ISO or MISO or to the south to CERC. So we can coordinate interchanges as well to meet that overall need of the region, which gives tremendous value to customers.
Aftab, I have one last question, which is really the takeaway. Put simply, are we going to have enough power?
So I would say that we will have enough power if we can work together to enact all of the improvements we just talked about, ranging from enhancements to our markets so that we're sending the right signals, enhancement to our interconnection process so that we can process new resources through quicker, and that we get support from important partners who develop the legislation, the policies, to work with us so that we can manage this transition in a coordinated way.
Next, we'll hear from Christi Tezak, Senior Director at Clearview Energy Partners, an independent research firm based in Washington, D.C., who draws on her decades of experience monitoring the energy landscape to weigh in on this new paradigm. Christi talks about pricing and the way load growth impacts energy affordability. Data centers need to lower their own demand, she says. Investment is key in mitigating cost issues for consumers. And she highlights reasons why we still need dispatchable generation to power the grid at high demand in order for a reliable energy expansion to take place. Here's Christi. Well, Christi, thanks for joining us. Where do you see demand and load growth coming, and how much power are you projecting or are you thinking will be needed as we go forward over the next decade?
What a difference the world has made in the last 3 to 5 years, right?
Sure.
For so long we toiled along with, flat is the new up.
Yeah.
And the correlation between GDP growth and electricity demand growth used to be lockstep, then it became broken, and now it's arguably completely disconnected. And I don't think anybody really has a good sense in terms of numbers. We aren't carrying specific projections on electricity market growth, in part because doing those sort of projections are a great way for analysts to be wrong. And the world is unpredictable. And it really, what is so challenging, I think, for the energy sector generally and the electricity sector specifically, is how many things could change. We look at where we were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and we didn't anticipate a lot of the things that we had to confront. And, if you take what's going on in AI, it's easy to extrapolate it a couple of years, and we've got, folks predicting 10x growth. We've got folks predicting 20%, 20x growth. But we also have an industry that is going to be hugely motivated to constrain that growth. Because they're going to have to pay for it. And if anything that we've observed over the last 3 or 4 years, I think, is that, electricity prices have finished their sort of in the trough, part of the curve. And we've pretty much got nowhere to go but up. Although we have a lot of very competitive resources on the grid, the discussions surrounding the expansion of transmission suggests that if we had headroom before, we've probably eroded it, and we're going to be needing to make incremental investment. So, these consumers, these data centers, are going to need to find ways to reduce their own consumption. And if AI is as smart as we all think it is, it may get us there quickly. And so that's part of the risk, I think, as a sector we face is, okay, we see this demand coming, but what if it shows up as less or on a different timescale?
What do you attribute are some of the factors or some of the things that are driving demand growth? Because yes, data centers and AI are part of it, but I think there's more to it than that. And I'm curious how you're thinking about that.
Well, certainly before we all got inundated with the AI wave, there were several significant factors that were afoot. One of them is the electrification of transportation. And certainly the electrification of residential heating as well, the shift to heat pumps. And those are, of course, underpinned in part by commodity prices, in part by a preference for lower carbon resources. And both of those things are things that often are less political in reality than they are rhetorically. I mean, the energy sector is certainly one that has been very much shaped by political trends and political opinions, and certain types of generation are preferred by certain political groups, which makes things difficult. We're talking about long-lived assets here. We're not looking at assets with 2 or 3 year payback periods. We're looking at investments that require 10 to 40 years to recoup, depending on the particular structure, whether it's in a market environment or whether it's in a regulated environment. So those are things that are already moving, because even if the administration changes, with the November elections, certainly what we observed, but under the Trump administration, is there was still a trend towards lower carbon energy requirements, and from businesses. So I think we're going to continue to see those trends, and as those businesses mature, their costs come down.
Yeah. So you touched on it a little bit, and I'm curious how you're thinking about what do you think is going to power the rising demand, at least in the short or medium term, however you want to define those time horizons?
Well, I certainly think that we're going to continue to rely on natural gas assets. I don't see how those are sidestepped, to align with the most aggressive hopes of some of the environmental advocates. It's the reality is, a lot of renewable generation and a lot of storage is still inverter based. We still have a grid that is built on reciprocating generation assets.
Yeah.
And while they will play together, and they are different. And, whether we eventually convert to, a fully inverter-based environment, or inverter-based resources continue to behave more and more like synchronized assets, we have this issue of timing. And the issue of, yes, we are putting tons of solar and tons of wind on the grid, and from an energy perspective, that is awesome. They are complementary, not every hour of every single day, but we get a lot of wind at night, we get a lot of solar during the day. Solar's less around in the winter than it is in the summer. That's sort of a planetary thing. And we have a lot of opportunity, but when push comes to shove, we still need some assets on the grid that respond when the control room hits the button. And in that respect, I think that transition is going to be harder and longer than some of the more than some folks who really prioritize decarbonization would like to see. And I think that in the near term, natural gas assets matter, certainly the ones we have. So seeing retirements of dispatchable generation, I think, is a natural and reasonable concern for system operators and regulators.
So we've talked about a lot of the things that I think are top of mind. And the one thing that we're trying to keep at the very top of mind is reliability. Do you see a concern for reliability here? I mean, we've talked a little about timing and how it may look and what the resources may be.
I think we have pretty serious reliability concerns now. How vulnerable we are, I think, depends. There's certainly folks who are very worried about the intermittent nature of, renewable energy assets. We have other issues besides that. We have storm and weather vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Winter Storm Elliott was no good time for anybody in PJM, for example. We are reliant on systems that are beyond the control of electricity market participants. Upstream production of gas was clearly one of the significant elements afoot in Elliott, and figuring out a way to collaboratively solve that problem, especially when it involves cooperation with folks who aren't regulated in the electricity business and who aren't part of the Fercosphere family, if you will, to borrow Cheryl LaFleur's line, which I still think is great. Those are things that are real. I mean, ask the folks in the wind and solar sectors about supply chain. Yeah. So these are all things that contribute to reliability in different ways. I think increasing interconnection between regional systems is a great idea. Right up until we have the conversation about who's paying for what and when.
Yeah.
And so it's great to say, well, thou shalt go build great interconnection between each other and maybe even Texas one day. But it costs money, and therefore someone pays for it. And as we started at the beginning of our conversation, prices are likely to go up from where they are now. And so even if we keep adding to the denominator with new customers, new demand, prices are still going to go up. And those conversations get hard politically.
Yeah. Have you thought at all about what your projection for those increases might be? Because I think you're right. I think we have been down in the bottom of the trough for some time, and what is being asked of the system is changing. The costs based on supply chain and demand and availability are all, interest rates also come to mind, are all driving some of these cost implications, but nobody seems to have a good handle on what it is. Higher could mean a penny higher. It could mean a dime per kilowatt hour higher. Have you thought about
I
that?
haven't thought of it so much in percentage terms, in part because it's hard to figure out what my goalposts are going to be.
Sure.
In order to figure out how steep the line is for how long. Because if you look at all of the rebids we've seen, for example, offshore wind.
Yeah.
Well, we get a couple of those signed. We start rolling those into customers' bills, and then we'll find out how fast the next solicitation is going to get done.
Yeah.
So, the old rule of thumb in the electric utility sector was you could probably get people to live with 4 to 6% annual increases without, folks jumping off any rhetorical cliffs.
Right.
But, we are also in an environment where we are facing inflation in other parts of the economy. That gets harder and harder to swallow. Yeah. And I think that that's going to potentially, that's one of the things that we see tempering, the rollout. I think it's good in many ways that if the wind contracts weren't going to work, that, folks have dropped back 5, regrouping, reissuing their solicitations, working it out. Again, and this is one of the things I think we need to be cognizant of when we're forecasting demand is let's not get too far out over our skis.
Right. So
that we make commitments that at the end of the day prove to be problematic in terms of stranded assets instead of in unaffordable contracting obligations. So I think that, again, it's iterative. You get some of these solicitations out, you roll them into rate base, they happen, they go into service, and then you reckon with what's next. If the economy is healthy, if things are booming, if people feel like, the economy is in a good place, then those increases don't seem like so much. If consumers feel that they're in a position where, every single thing that they're facing is going up, then they are going to go to their regulator and say, fix this.
Yeah, make it stop.
Make it stop.
Yeah. As we talk about the regulators and policymakers a little, you kind of led right into my next question, which is what's going to be able to help us meet the moment for this rising demand while we try to mitigate cost, reduce emissions, deploy innovation? I mean, we're asking the system to do an awful lot of things all at one time. Do you have any thoughts around policies that would help enable some of that? Or are there incremental things that just need to be done because we're going to have to sort through it? And these are some of the steps to kickstart that process.
Well, I think we've got a lot underway that hasn't had a chance to really take root. Like I said, we don't know where these solicitations go. And, does the addition of all these large utility scale renewables help or hurt reliability? Right. We've got so many difficult questions related to their capacity contribution because it's clearly more than zero, but it clearly differs from other assets.
Yep.
So, and that's a hard nut. And, that remains an in progress thing. Looking at what's going on with the interest in co-located loads, both with existing and future assets. Yeah. So we've got the very high profile, interconnection services agreement pending before FERC between Taylor and Susquehanna, and the Amazon data center, Cumulus and, PPL, sponsored by, submitted by PJM and the pushback there. But in some ways, to me, that is exactly the kind of market response we should see. It wasn't all that long ago that nuclear units were very much unloved in organized markets. Nobody cared if they lived or died. Some states took action. New York and Illinois took action to preserve theirs. Pennsylvania didn't. And so here's a Pennsylvania unit that's now figured out an option to improving its long-term viability. And there are folks who aren't so sure how they feel about that because they see it as a loss to the market. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you weren't all that involved. So I think it's interesting because we've seen so much bilateral contracting to support renewables.
Yep.
And if we're not going to see utilities move forward with SMRs, if we had a couple well-heeled commercial enterprises willing to take the bet on SMRs, willing to bring the concept to market. The utility industry loves to be first to be second.
Right.
So if the private sector wants to help blaze that trail, I think we should welcome that. And so I think, there's going to be an opportunity, a challenge in how are we going to recognize and treat everybody the same way? I mean, Is a nuclear unit reducing capacity to serve a co-located load really that much different than a retirement? Is it better or worse for the system if we have a huge new user come in and they're subscribing to an underutilized asset, or they're subscribing to a brand new asset, like, an SMR?
Yep.
You look at additionality, and if it's maybe it's an SMR plus renewables plus storage. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity there. Microgrids, I think, are something we could see in this space to serve those sorts of industries. And I think we have to recognize that these are market responses. They're market responses the same way advocates have argued that the integration of renewables is a market response to the political desire to change the nation's portfolio. And so I think to the extent we can set politics aside and look at what the opportunity set is and how to be most agnostic to resources, I think we as consumers will have the most benefit.
You've kind of summed it up already, but I'm going to ask you to maybe come up with 3 things that you think that policymakers or investors or the public need to think about. I mean, you gave a pretty good list just a moment ago, but are there 3 things that you say, look, you've got to keep these 3 things in mind, because if you do, then we can navigate this successfully. But if you fail to account for them, those are the things that are going to create the potholes in the road, or that's going to get us off track.
Well, the things I see that are likely to throw us off track are actually beyond any of those uncertainties.
Okay.
We have a big election coming up in November.
Right.
We have very, very different approaches to government, to energy, to markets. And we've had some major decisions come down from the Supreme Court, which have changed the math of the regulation that this sector tends to rely on. We already had an uncertain environment, and it's likely to continue to be uncertain.
Yeah.
And one of the things that at Clearview, we wrote about when the Chevron and corner store decisions were handed down were, there's less, durability in regulation now, and that may not be good. Even for those who prefer less regulation. So, for example, if an agency comes out with a rule and you like it, and it's good for your business, but it's under appeal by someone who disagrees, can you actually move forward with an investment to bring that forward while it's under appeal? Because if it gets overturned, then maybe your whole premise gets overturned and you've put capital at risk.
Yep.
So I think what we've seen is the increased politicization. And in some ways, I think that's unfortunate, because there is so much innovation going on. There is so much opportunity. There is a willingness to rise to the moment and meet this growing demand. I mean, how long have we been waiting for it, Todd? We've been waiting for growing demand for a long time.
Right. 15 or 20 years.
Asset owners want to see that, and their investors want to see it. But if things are going to be uncertain, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And so, not all the news is bad. Not all the news is good. The system is going to continue to change.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energy Rush. On the next episode, we'll be hearing from competitive power suppliers who are positioned to meet the moment and supply much-needed power to the system. We'll talk with representatives from Vistra Corp, Competitive Power Ventures, and Invenergy on ways they're addressing load growth and the opportunities that come from being able to meet this demand. If you like this podcast series, we invite you to check out Energy Solutions, EPSA's regular monthly podcast, featuring the voices and stories from a changing energy grid. You can find all those episodes on our website or your favorite major podcast platform. Subscribe, follow, leave a rating, and comment on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Pandora. And follow us on X at EPSA News, on Threads at Electric Power Supply, and LinkedIn for more news and updates from America's competitive power suppliers. The music in this episode was written and produced by Let Me Hold That Ltd.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That, Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.